Parsons' topic for today is All the Bloomy Flush of Life, Illinois Country French Settlements, 1700, 1780. So please welcome Sharon.
Thank you. I retired 5 years ago, and I think my teacher voice retired with me. So if you can't hear, I'm going to beg you maybe to move a little closer. And I have an illustration. Again, I had no idea I would be in such a large room. So I hope that you'll be able to see that. Don't have a microphone, so again, please let me know if you're having difficulty hearing, but I'm not sure how much louder I can go than this. So, the years 1700 and 1765 bookend the French colonial period of Illinois history. What was called the Illinois Country, or for our purposes today, the mid-Mississippi Valley, was claimed as part of the French overseas empire from the first explorations of Marquette and Joliet in 1673. I learned that in 8th grade, and that was about it. It was a one-sentence French history of Illinois. Around 1700, the first villages emerged, and they were gatherings of priests, Native Americans, and French Canadians. Now, I have to tell you, I was instructed to talk about the farmers, the habitants, the priests, and soldiers. And so I'm not really talking about Native Americans or the enslaved, and that is very strange for me because my book over there with Professor Eckberg has a lot to do with the Native Americans. So that's why I was guided a little bit into a certain area, and I want you to understand why I'm not addressing Native Americans. So, the French kings in this period were absolute monarchs. History doesn't consider them tyrants. We're talking Louis XIV, Louis XV. The law in Illinois was French law. Only the Roman Catholic religion was allowed. Those two elements determined much of daily life. Jews were explicitly banned. Settlers did not come to the Illinois country seeking religious freedom. There were no jury trials. Lawyers were considered troublemakers, and they were also banned from the whole French-American enterprise. The military commandant at Fort Deschartres was also the head of the local provincial council, a body of just 3 men. They heard evidence, they decided legal disputes, they administered the law. None of these conditions appeared to be very controversial to the residents, which is not to say there wasn't from time to time a little bit of pushing back against the rules. The Jesuit priests in Kaskaskia were the first European authorities in the Native American French village. The priests maintained the rhythms of the Roman Catholic calendar with observances, including feast days. They performed the rites and kept written records of baptisms, marriages, and burials of all of the people living there, all the baptized folks living there. The priests willingly performed marriage ceremonies for converted Native American women and suitable Frenchmen, even after the practice was discouraged by authorities in New Orleans. The priests also monitored the moral standards for their flock. They complained most about the debauchery, that was always the word, the debauchery of the voyageurs, the single men who plied the rivers in the Indian trade for most of the year. Whenever they came to town, whenever they came to Kaskaskia, the priests would get very protective of the Native American converts in their flock. Okay, sometimes the priests were called on to be hostage negotiators when the Native American villages were raided by others of their women and children. Many of the priests learned the Native American languages, and several created really important dictionaries. Fort Deschartres, lying north of Kaskaskia, was the northernmost military outpost of the Louisiana colony. Soldiers in Illinois were called Marines because Illinois was an overseas colony. So they were run from the Department of the Marines. Marines, yeah, they're called French Marines in all the records. The soldiers lived at the fort for the most part, and actually very little is known about the rank and file soldiers. But the officers might marry and live in the village outside the fort, and so they are better known to history. The soldiers sometimes joined the Illinois natives with whom they were allied in the native fights, particularly against the Foxes from up north in Wisconsin-ish. And then the natives would join the soldiers as allies in their campaigns against the British, especially in the French and Indian War. The presence of the military was viewed by the villagers as essential. Margaret Brown, if you know her name, one of the most respected historians of French Illinois, her view was that the commandant represented the positive qualities of government: stability, assurance of rights, and protection. The hierarchy of command was really not questioned. So, I need a drink, pardon me. So, to sum up, to acknowledge that the French villagers of Kaskaskia and its neighbors lived in an empire of an absolute monarch with military leaders serving in judicial roles, with no policy of religious tolerance, doesn't mean that we can't find some resonance with what we would call today our small d democratic values. Accepting royal edicts as the sole basis of power overlooks the villagers' everyday responses to their situation. So I have two things for your consideration. First was that law, that French law. It was called the Customary Law of Paris, the Coutume de Paris. It was a set of rules developed over several hundred years in northern France. It was codified beginning in the 16th century. I consider myself kind of a geek on that French law. You can find it all online, but not translated. The sections of law dealing with domestic life, especially estates and succession, in other words, inheritance, contain an interesting element of egalitarian treatment, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit. So this law first arrived in the Illinois country in 1719 with those first government officials, and one of them was a notary. A notary in French Illinois was very different from what we consider a notary's job today. Today, what? They witness your signature and put on a stamp. Back then, they drafted legal documents, and the documents were legally binding. He kept a file in his office, made copies for the parties to the document. It was a very official position, and it was his duty to explain the law and to carry out these documents for the villagers. Let me see. Before that, before 1719, the priests had tried to uphold these rules because everybody kind of knew them. This was deeply ingrained from things they brought with them from France. The French customary law applied to everyone, including the French Marines and the Native American wives of Frenchmen, excluding only the Native Americans who lived in their separate villages. And if we have to think about power, I think that the French law was a source of power. So let me give you an example soon. A couple's married life often began with a marriage contract. It was an ancient French version of a legal prenup. Women's property rights and financial safeguards in marriage were spelled out in the contract in pretty great detail, and many of the rights and safeguards applied in a general way, even if a couple did not have a contract. So regarding inheritance then, when one spouse died, the estate was divided 50-50 between the survivor. Didn't matter if it was the widow or the widower. The estate was divided 50-50, half going to the survivor, the other half to the children from that marriage. And among the children sharing that half, the shares were equal, no matter the age, no matter the sex. Girls and boys inherited equal parts of their parents' estate. I'd like to give an example, if I can, because I spend all my time reading the documents, and it seems strange not to talk about one, so give me a minute. After the death of Jacques Lecourse, he died between 1760 and 1763, for example, the estate inventory and valuation of, and it included slaves, and goods was drawn up and divided into lots of equal monetary value. The way the lots were distributed among the heirs was typical for French estate partitions. And I always love this. So the way they did it, there were little slips of paper on which was written first lot, second lot, third, fourth, fifth lot, on little slips of paper. The slips of paper were placed in a hat borrowed from a passing child. There was always a child passing by. So they put the slips, and it was always a boy, of course, because they needed the right kind of hat, I guess. So they put the little slips of paper in a hat, shook it up, and that child, who was disinterested and, impartial, would draw the lots out of the hat and give each one to the heirs. Okay, in this family, there were 2 sons and 3 daughters, ranging in age from minor, under 25, to adult, over 25. Each heir received the estimated value of 3,500 French livres. At that time, that was enough to build a nice stone house. That's a pretty nice inheritance. This guy was well off. Skeptical historians call this requirement that shares be equal among the children, they call it an example of forced heirship, meaning it's a bad thing. My own view is that a girl could make a better marriage with an equal share of property. So I do not view it in such a negative way. The customs of making and honoring marriage contract promises and resolving some of these intricacies of estate division under French law remained quite strong even into the American period. They liked their rules, and they wanted to keep them. The second characteristic of the French period is very grassroots, and pun intended, concerning the farmers. The first American governor of Indiana said this about the French at Vincennes. Quote, "You may behold at one and the same time 100 plows going under one enclosure, which belongs to the French, who cultivate in common. Their customs are often very ridiculous and grating to the feelings of an American." That was 1807. So, what he's talking about, then, if I have my maps. Okay. So this is the part where I'm not sure you'll be able to see. These maps were done in 1807, the same year that governor made that comment. Here's the Mississippi River. It's flowing that way, south. Here's north. So this is Kaskaskia. Here's the Kaskaskia River. And so I hope you can see there's a little thing here that says Kaskaskia Village. It was a compact village. Everybody lived in the village. Okay, everybody lived together in the village. You can imagine what that did for privacy. Then of the 3 parts, the second you can see the lines here. Inside this was the common field, and that's what that Indiana governor was talking about, sorry. What the Indiana governor was talking about. There's a huge common field and here, and they would all go together and plow their fields. The third part lies outside the plowed fields here, and it was called the commons, which is really confusing. This was the common field, and that was the commons. The commons was a grazing area for livestock, and anybody could turn their cows. What do they have? They had cattle, pigs, and horses. That's all they had back in those days. So again, 3 parts. The village, the common arable fields, and the common pasturage. Okay. And then Carl Eckberg, my co-author and the dawn of Illinois country history in the French period, describes it as old world baggage. To divide up the common fields like this. I don't think you need to see real closely to get the idea. This was that common arable field, and this was the way it was distributed. Long strips running from well, here's the village, close to the village, running to the river. This was how the land was divided in all French-style villages in the Illinois country. So Kaskaskia, Fort de Chartres, Prairie du Rocher, St. Genevieve, St. Louis. They were all that basic configuration. Okay. Compact villages, as we saw, clearly promote cooperative communal efforts. In 1785, Cahokian Antoine Girardin mused that individual freedoms had to be circumscribed if communal activities were to succeed. And the most important communal activities revolved around agriculture, not just plowing together. So these two sections of land, again, were the fields for plowing and the grazing commons. And if you remember the picture here, there was a common border. There was a common border here. Inside were the fields to be plowed, and outside was the grazing area. So they told me I wouldn't have PowerPoint, and this was my best solution. So again, these are individually owned parcels. Everybody's job was to keep the fence at the end of their land in good repair, because what happened was after the crops had been gathered in the fall, the animals that had been in that common grazing land were turned loose into the arable fields until spring planting. But once the fields were planted, the fences had to keep them back in the commons area. So you understand there had to be a lot of cooperation. And you can see that throughout the document. 1727 was the first record of a petition of the inhabitants of Kaskaskia to the commandant saying a lot of different things, but among it, what the fencing regulation should be. So this gets me to my second tradition. First was the law, and the second were these village assemblies where they made important decisions that applied to everybody. Okay. How's my time?
You have 9 minutes.
Oh gosh, well, I'm not going to skip this part. Okay, so 1727, again, was the first really long petition from the inhabitants. I was surprised, 1727, and these folks are illiterate, mind you, but they drafted a quite detailed petition to the commandant at Kaskaskia saying how they wanted to manage their own rules about the common field, turning the animals loose, putting the animals back, how to manage people who didn't take care of their fences. That was an annual thing. There was somebody who wasn't taking good care of their fences. So 1737, the commandant and judge made a public order that livestock were not to be allowed to roam freely in the field until after All Saints. When was All Saints? November 1st. Yeah. So they were not to be allowed to roam freely until after All Saints. All settlers must maintain their part of the commons fence on pain of a 100-livre fine payable to the hospital. That was a lot of corn, pelts, however they would pay that. I mean, the money was not a thing. Okay. And the livestock must be enclosed again on the grazing common on April 1st. Well, that wasn't enough time. So the villagers got together, wrote a petition, and said, give us more time. The commandant gave them 2 more weeks till April 15th. April 15th came and went. Not all the livestock was out of the fields. So there was a final public announcement that all settlers must enclose their livestock by May 9th on a pain of 50 livres and a confiscation of the livestock. You didn't follow the rules, you lost your cows and pigs. This order was read by the priest at High Mass, which again gives you an idea of how important the church was. If there was something you needed everybody to know, announce it at church. So most agricultural regulations came from collective decisions of the villagers, and it happened through whole village assemblies. They discussed common issues, drafted petitions, they held elections for church wardens, militia officers, and what were called syndics. In 1738, they requested permission. They did have to ask permission to have their assemblies, to elect a syndic for maintaining the commons fence and other duties. The assembly met probably directly after Mass at the home of the militia captain. His name was Michel Philippe. He was the widower of Marie Rouenza, if you know local history. She was the most famous Native American convert. The assembly was noted as including militia officers and inhabitants of the parish. Voting members, in addition to the adult males, may also have included free blacks and widows who had independent authority. We don't really know because that was not a very big population. I have one free black person in the 1726 census, and no widows. So, but it seems from later time when there were more of each that it is entirely likely that they had a voice. They elected Antoine Bienvenu, and he promised to well and faithfully administer his office for the profit and in the interests of the parish. Notice that his promise was not to the king, it was not to the governor, it was to his community, to his parish community. According to Margaret Brown again, despite the strength of local assemblies, villagers were not used to operating in a democratic way above the local level. However, they were adept at avoiding undesirable governmental influence in their lives, and what later British and Americans saw as their observed conformity had more to do with community safety than lack of an independent spirit. So 1700 to 1765 was the French period. 1765 to 1780, that's my time period, our time period here for Era 1, was the decline, but not the disappearance of French influence. Briefly, after the British took possession of Fort Deschartres in 1765, the Illinois country suffered a 13-year period, including a succession of more or less competent and corrupt British military commandants. They made stops and starts at forming a civil government, and that civil government was really important to the French villagers. Many of them, as we say, voted with their feet, and they crossed the river and went over to St. Genevieve, and some to St. Louis. The village that surrounded the fort, which had rivaled Kaskaskia in the 1720s, ceased to exist almost immediately after the British took over the fort in 1765. A visitor some years later looking for the ruins found only what he called an area covered with wild herbs. My quotation, the title, "The Bloomy Flush of Life," conjures up a vibrant community. The line comes from a poem by British poet Oliver Goldsmith, who was lamenting his own deserted village in 1770. A few lines read, "Desolation saddens all their green, no busy steps their grass-grown footways tread, but all the bloomy flush of life is fled." Again. Fort Deschartres was soon abandoned by the British after just 5 years. In 1772, the arrival of George Rogers Clark and his Virginians in 1778 initiated the American period. The remaining French essentially welcomed the Americans, and the age of European dominion was over on the east bank of the Mississippi. Thank you. Is there time for any questions?
We've got about 3 minutes of questions.
Anybody? I know, you're all nervous about your assignment, where you have to go next, right? Yes?
How much of the French legal or traditions continued into the American period? Or did they abandon it with the English?
Well, they did not abandon it, no. And in fact, these marriage contracts, if they were made, say, in the late 1760s, early 1770s, they were considered valid, and the British had to uphold them. And the British, when they came in, and there's even a document from Virginia in 1778, said that the new government would respect the rules that had been there. So you actually see litigation into the 19th century of some of the women trying to get what was promised to them in their marriage contracts. Yeah. Yes?
Was the British had a war, the French and the British war to take over that area?
Yes, the French lost the French and Indian War in 1763. They knew beforehand what was down. I mean, they lost a big battle in 1759 up at Fort Niagara, 1759, and that was people from the Illinois country were lost in that battle. So they understood as soon as they lost that battle that the end was coming. So from 1759 to 1763, you can bet they were making plans, because they understood that east of the Mississippi would become British, west of the Mississippi would become Spanish, but it was Bourbon family monarchy, and pretty much the same as, in many respects, the same as French. Yes?
Any estimation of the total population of the region?
I knew somebody would ask me that. I brought some notes. The total population, I'm going to say never really more than 1,000. It was, and maybe that was one reason that things were kind of easy to accomplish. It was not blooming in that sense. No. No.
Okay. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you all.